I'm Gail Sklar. I'm president of the Washington Native Plant Society and chair of Native Plant Appreciation Month. I would like to welcome you to our first program in our series, Prairie Preservation, April 2024. We invite you to learn about this year's theme by visiting the website at wnps.org. Our speakers this month will share knowledge of Washington state prairies and plant communities both historically and in the face of modern changes to the land. In addition, the webpage for each chapter includes activities that celebrate native plants, such as webinars, plant sales, field trips, and volunteer opportunities galore. The mission of the Washington Native Plant Society is to promote the appreciation and conservation of Washington's native plants and their habitats through study, education, and advocacy. If you're already a member, we thank you for joining us. Membership supports native plant conservation and education. It also connects native plant enthusiasts across the state. To learn more about our work, please visit wnps.org. As a member of the South Sound chapter, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Coast Salish people, the original and continuing stewards of the coastlines and forests of the Salish Sea and the South Sound, and for all their work in conserving the beauty of our state for thousands upon thousands of years. I now have the honor of introducing our speaker of the evening, Andrea Thorpe. And I met Andrea when she presented to a new Washington Native Plant Society steward class in the South Sound. She is a natural resources program manager at the Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission. In this position, she is responsible for guiding the natural resource stewardship throughout Washington State Park system that includes 124 parks and properties covering over 138,000 acres. Andrea has a broad background in applied ecology, with particular expertise in plant ecology. Her previous work experience includes serving as the Washington Natural Heritage Program Manager in the Department of Natural Resources, the Director of Science at the National Ecological Observatory Network, a continental scale ecological observatory funded by the National Science Foundation. And I won't try to say that fast 3 times. And the director of the Conservation Research Program at the Institute for Applied Ecology, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring and managing native species and ecosystems. Andrea has a doctorate in ecology focused on impacts of invasive plants on plant and microbial communities and nutrient cycling from the University of Montana, a master's in ecology focused on the population ecology of a rare plant from San Diego State University, and Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Oregon State University. In her free time, I don't know how she has any, you can often find her out on the trail somewhere in the woods with her dogs. And before I begin, I'm going to ask you to please put your comments in Q&A or chat. And at the very end, Elena, and if I pronounce her name incorrectly, I hope she'll forgive me, Kowitz, when I will take turns asking Andrea your questions. So sit back and enjoy a real adventure this evening.
Thanks so much, Gail. Can you confirm that you can hear me all right, Gail?
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. And I really do feel privileged that you've come to join us on such a beautiful evening, somewhat uncharacteristically for the beginning of April. So welcome to the first talk for Native Plant Appreciation Month. It really was an honor to be asked by Gail to give this talk to you tonight. And this talk is really intended to be a general overview of our state's prairie ecosystems. And I will say that for those of you who care about such things, I'm going to be using common names throughout, not scientific names. I really wanted to make it kind of a fun tour for everyone about our state's prairies. So I've been working, and Gail gave you a bit of my background, in the conservation, management, and restoration of native ecosystems in Oregon, Washington for nearly 30 years now. And so when Gail said that the topic was going to be on prairies, I was really excited. I was like, great, I feel like I know a fair amount about the prairies in our ecoregion. And then I was thinking about it, I was like, well, what actually defines a prairie? Because I alternately use the words grassland, alternately use the words prairie. So I decided, well, okay, first of all, just go to what, let's go to Google. Let's have the Googles what a prairie is. Well, this was the first answer that popped up. It was a definition. The reason was that in The Winning of the West, Teddy Roosevelt described that we early on took on the word prairie because when our backwoodsmen first reached the land in the Midwest and saw the great natural meadows of long grass, sights unknown in the gloomy forest wherein they had always dwelt, they knew not what to call them and borrowed the term already in use among the French inhabitants. Okay, well, so the French had been using the word prairie, and the translation for prairie in French is essentially meadow. So that didn't tell me anything. So then I went back to biology, ecology 101. What did I learn from my undergrad years? And in general, kind of the general definition was, okay, well, prairies have virtually no tree cover, about less than 10% tree cover. Savannas have less than 30% tree cover. So prairie is something without very much tree cover. Well, but then I started thinking about the different plant communities we have in the parks that I manage. And this is a picture of a plant community up at Mount Spokane State Park in one of the meadows that we have up there. And when we had the Natural Heritage Program go out and do a vegetation survey at this meadow, they identified it as a greenleaf fescue, Idaho fescue meadow. So they defined it as actually a meadow instead of a prairie. And when we go to Beacon Rock State Park, we have similarly kind of a community that's dominated by grasses and forbs. And the grasses are very similar. They're very closely related to the greenleaf and Idaho fescue. It's redleaf fescue in this case. And some of the other species in this community are the same, if not very similar in stature and growth habit, but this is called a grassland community. So we have two different plant communities that both kind of met the Ecology 101 definition by having less than 10% tree cover. But when we had the official kind of vegetation survey done, they were called either a meadow or a grassland. So I emailed Joe, the program manager at the Washington Natural Heritage Program. I said, Joe, what do you use? What is the official definition according to the U.S. National Vegetation Classification? Like, what is a prairie? And it turns out the word prairie, the word grassland, the word even meadow, it's kind of like, the equivalent of common names for scientific names. Like, they're more colloquial terms. They're terms that we use to describe kind of a concept, and they are used alternately depending on where you are. So for example, in many Midwestern states, the things that we would refer to as balds, such as this grassland community at Beacon Rock, we often refer to that as a bald community. In the Midwest, they'd often call them a glade or an opening or a barren. And so when we talk about prairies, it's really just this kind of concept and this understanding that it could mean something different to someone else. But, in some ways, it's almost like one of those, like, it when you see it, but in general, in this talk, I'm going to refer to generally grasslands that we have throughout the state of Washington, and focusing in on a few very specific types of grassland plant communities that we have in the state of Washington. So hopefully you have maybe a little bit better sense of what a prairie is, although maybe it's a little bit muddier. But I think what helps to get a better understanding of what a prairie is understanding what makes a prairie. So we have this idea of how plant communities form. And initially, after, say, a major disturbance, say, the eruption of Mount St. Helens or the glaciers retreating at the end of the last ice age, what they left behind were these kind of really rocky, barren, landscapes that over time we had some mosses join and some lichens. And then after those, we started to get the grasses and the forbs moving into these ecosystems. So grasses and forbs being, what, typically have the showy flowers. These species tend to be able to deal a little bit better with very little soil. They do a little bit better often with lower nutrient contents, maybe in droughtier conditions. They are generally quick to reproduce, so they can often reproduce the first year that they're growing. And they need a lot of sunlight. They don't do very well in shaded conditions. And going back to talking about the bald communities, this is often what we see in some of these grassland balds, such as what we have at Beacon Rock, such as if you can see the bottom part of the background in my photo, which is a grassland bald community up at Moran State Park. And we have a lot of these grassland bald communities that are on these really, really rocky substrates where it's really difficult for trees to grow. There just isn't that much soil, so their roots don't have very much space to grow. It's pretty droughty. There isn't very much soil moisture holding capacity. And so because of that, we tend to get these grassland type communities. And, you'll get to see some, more soil development in there. You'll see the plants are a little bit more lush, and you might even start to see some shrubs coming up towards that area. But again, these are the areas that are going to be dominated by grasslands and forbs. When we think, though, about how these communities start to develop, it isn't everywhere that is extremely rocky. And as the soil starts to develop over time, and in areas where there is already significant soil development, then we start to get a succession of different kinds of plant communities. And this is in ecology, the concept called succession. So over time, you have shrubs coming into the system. Shrubs are going to be a little bit slower to grow. It takes a little bit longer for them to reproduce, often not reproducing within their first year of growth. But over time, as they start to grow and grow taller, they'll start to shade out the grasses and the forbs that were there before. And then over time, those shrubs themselves will be replaced with trees that can grow taller and shade out the shrubs. And eventually, you give it a long enough time, you're going to get to a large old growth decadent stand. And indeed, this is something that we're seeing across the landscape. So I'm going to show you a series of photos here that have been taken at Palouse Prairie Ecological Reserve that's managed by Washington State University. This first photo was taken in 1916, and the first several of these photos are a time series that were taken by Daubenmeier, who was really kind of a famous plant ecologist who is from Washington. So if you pay attention in particular to what's going on in the foreground and in the side slopes, look to see what's happening to the vegetation in this time series. So 1916, moving on to 1939, 1968, 1980, and now in 2008. And you can see over time, we had this succession of shrubs and trees moving in, especially into that foreground and all along the sides of that hill slope, as those shrubs and trees were able to invade and overtake the grasses and the forbs. So that's that successional pathway happening. But what's important, is that we know that we have a history of having prairies and grasslands in our ecosystems for a long period of time, for centuries. And so the thing that's required to keep this, to kind of arrest succession, to keep this from happening, to, maintain these grasslands and prairies within our ecosystems, is that we had to have some level of disturbance to basically move things back down towards these prairie and grassland ecosystems. And I'm sure what many of you are aware of is that the grasslands that we have here in Washington were very much maintained by traditional practices of regular fire. So it's known that the native peoples set regular fires to the prairies on average of about every 1 to 5 years. Some systems a little bit longer, but they set these regular fires in order to promote the first foods, the foods that were important to the first peoples. It's been estimated that there were 50 different plant species that were regularly harvested within these meadow and prairie communities. And on Thursday at 7, there's going to be a First Peoples panel discussion talking about these first foods. And so when we think about prairies in our landscapes and why they're rare in these systems anymore, one of the biggest reasons that we don't see as many prairies as we would historically is the fact that we have essentially stopped this regular practice of burning and maintaining these prairie ecosystems. So looking again at these pictures, you can see in 1916, this prairie community that had a assemblage of grasses and forbs and very few shrubs or trees on the landscape, to 2008, with the lack of any regular fire, we have this invasion of more shrubs and trees. And you can even see this in a lot of the names that we have for places. We have some hills that are called bald hills, or, but when you look at them, they're not bald. They have a bunch of trees. And that's because, historically, it was actually when it was first, the areas first settled, there weren't any trees on top of them. But with the lack of regular disturbance, the trees were able to invade and change how an area looked compared to what it historically used to be maintained as. Very much related to the impacts of colonialism and the cessation of the regular prairie fires is the development of the areas that these prairies occurred. So prairie and grassland communities tend to occur in the lowland areas and in the flatter areas. And these are often the areas that are the prime areas for development for urban areas. So here's an example of the South Sound prairies in the Olympia, Tumwater, Lacey area going up to Tacoma. And in the upper photo or upper map, you can see in green the historic extent of the South Sound prairies. It's been estimated that there used to be about 150,000 acres of these glacial outwash prairies in this area. We've now lost about 97% of them, so that we only have remaining these smaller chunks of prairies that are in orange in that lower map. And most of those being on the Fort Lewis Military Reservation on Joint Base Lewis McChord. So while some of that has been lost because of conversion to forests, a lot of that has also been lost because of urbanization and development on top of those glacial outwash prairies. We have a similar story happening on the east side of the mountains over in the Palouse. The Palouse bioregion used to occupy a really extensive area in southeast Washington and northwest Idaho. And, you know, it was miles upon miles of these rolling hills of, you know, grasslands and forbs. And they were growing on top of this really rich soil that had been left behind by Glacial Lake Missoula from the floods when the dam at Glacial Lake Missoula, the dam that's holding back the waters, you know, burst, and then the waters from Glacial Lake Missoula flooded out through, you know, what is now the, you know, the scablands of eastern Washington, and then rushed down the Columbia River. All of those different processes deposited all of this beautiful, you know, silt from the lake. It was blown around into the rolling hills that we have in the Palouse. And in contrast to what we see over in Western Washington, where these beautiful kind of flat lowland areas were developed into urban areas, in contrast, in Eastern Washington, what we see is that these, you know, really rich areas have been converted to agriculture. And these are the wheat fields that the Palouse are now famous for. So similarly, we have lost a huge amount of the Palouse Prairies. It's estimated that we have probably only about 1% of the Palouse Prairies remaining, with the largest segment of those prairies being at Steptoe Butte, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. And then the last big threat that I really wanted to mention is the threat from invasive species. Now, many of you on this call are probably overly familiar with these invasive species. These typically are species that have been introduced from Europe and Asia. And a lot of them have been introduced for, you know, what were thought to be beneficial reasons, whether it be adding nitrogen back into soils, being feed for different animals because they were pretty. Some of them were by accident, but because of the fact that they were, you know, oftentimes introduced without their typical predators, they had some, you know, characteristic that was different to the ecosystem. They've really been able to take over the areas where they've invaded. So some of the most common invasive species that we have in our prairie ecosystems are species like Scotch broom, this yellow flowering shrub here in the photo that, again, many of you are probably overly familiar with. And then in the photo with all of the pretty yellow daisies, those are oxeye daisies. You can also see some self-heal, and then a bunch of invasive pasture grasses. This photo was taken at the wet prairie at Lewis and Clark State Park. It previously was used as a pasture for grazing, and so it has a lot of invasive pasture grasses and other species in it. There are some native species that are still lurk underneath all the invasives, but it's very much dominated by the invasive plants in the area. So admittedly, what I've painted so far is pretty gloomy of a picture, where we have these native prairie plant communities that are dominated by native annual and perennial forbs and our native perennial bunch grasses, which I was thinking they're so, you know, they're really nice and tidy grasses that have these really nice little crowns and give lots of room for all the other plants in the community, that through a lack of disturbance and development and invasion by exotic species. And the fourth factor, which I had to put on the slide, but admittedly I didn't give much, I haven't talked about yet, but climate change. Through these factors, we've converted it from these lovely native prairie communities to these really kind of species poor, degraded grassland communities where they're even left. These degraded, you know, where we have some of these grassland communities, a lot of them have been overtaken by invasive species, and really aren't serving a lot of the functions that that they historically would have served, both as far as providing, food for people, but as well as providing ecosystem services, providing habitat for rare plants, or for, rare plants, but also rare animals, providing all of the other ecosystem services that a healthy functioning system provides. But it really isn't that that negative, that doom and gloom of a scenario that this sounds like, because for decades now, there have been some really great efforts to conserve and manage these prairie ecosystems. And I know that a lot of you who are on this talk tonight who are attending have been involved in many of these efforts and could probably talk about them much better than I could. So my apologies if I do not do them justice. But really through decades of conservation of land, and then using a bunch of different tools in our restoration and management toolbox, including prescribed fire, the responsible targeted use of herbicides, mowing and prescribed grazing, and seeding, we're seeing that we're able to start moving some of these degraded prairie ecosystems into these much more functional native prairie communities. And so in this second kind of part of the talk, I want to shift to talking about some of these success stories. What is it that we have seen works in conserving our and managing our prairie ecosystems, and where you can potentially even go see some of them. So I'm going to focus on 3 different areas. So one being the South Sound Prairies here near where I'm at, standing here in Olympia, then go over to Columbia Hills State Park down along the Columbia River Gorge, and then finish up over at Steptoe Butte on the east side. So I'm going to start off with, like I said, the South Sound Prairies over here by Olympia Lacey area. And the South Sound Prairies are really part of a much larger prairie complex that's part of the Willamette Valley, Puget Trough, Georgia Basin ecoregion. And these prairies used to extend all the way from British Columbia down through the South Sound, and then into the much more rich and deep soils that we have down in the Willamette Valley. And despite the fact that there is actually very different types of climate and soils involved, the species that are within these prairies are very similar throughout this ecoregion. As I mentioned earlier, there was thought that there's once about 150, 180,000 acres of these prairies, and now only 3% of these grasslands remain. And along with this loss of the prairies, we've also seen a great reduction of many of the species that depend on these prairies. This is a list of just the federally listed, or recently federally listed, rare plant and animal species that are in Oregon. Here in Washington, there's several other species of concern that are only known to occur in Oregon. And I wanted to mention that Susan Waters is going to be talking on April 15th about the relationship of 5 threatened and endangered plant species and their pollinators. So we'll get into the details about some more of these species then. And because of the concern and the knowledge that so many species were at risk, and concern about the ecosystems themselves, for, as I mentioned, several decades now, there have been really dedicated efforts to try to conserve and restore these ecosystems. And these efforts include actually physically removing and masticating the different trees and shrubs that have invaded these prairies, bringing fire back to the prairies through prescribed burn programs, following up those fires with very specific targeted use of herbicides to target the different invasive plant communities that are coming in. Where we can't burn, we're using mowing, and in some places we're trying grazing with sheep to see if we can mimic some of the beneficial impacts of prescribed fire. And then there've been a lot of efforts to increase the amount of native seed that we can use in restoration, because that's been one of the things that has really been lacking, is not having enough native seed to add back into these systems after these restoration efforts, because we just don't have the seed available in the seed banks. And after decades of this work and really collaborative work, it's been something where, you know, the people that I was talking to 25, 30 years ago doing this work, they're still here today, or they're still, you know, they might be retired, but they're still engaged and involved, sharing lessons learned, and things change. You know, the landscape changes over time, but we're really seeing some beneficial results from this work. And Dave Wilderman is going to talk later on in the Native Plant Appreciation Month program about some of the work that they're doing in the South Sound Prairies. So definitely tune into his talk for that. And if you want to see some of these prairies, I definitely encourage you to check out Prairie Appreciation Day, which is held annually on the second Saturday in May at Maima Mounds Natural Area Preserve and the nearby Glacial Heritage Preserve. So leaving the South Sound Prairies, if we drive down I-5 and then head over east on Highway 84, we'll run into Columbia Hills State Park. Now, in 1993, 3,338 acres of the expansive Dalles Mountain Ranch became Dalles Mountain State Park, which was later combined with Horseshoe Lake to become Columbia Hills State Park. The natural steppe grassland habitats in Dalles Mountain State Park were modified during the grazing era from when it was Dalles Mountain Ranch through the sowing of native cultivar grasses, and especially the native cultivar of the native Snake River wheatgrass. The cultivar, which we called Secar, again, while it originates from a native collection, it has been modified in production so that it really acts, you know, it acts more like an invasive species, even though its origins had been from this native species. And then even more confusing, at one point, it was thought to be blue bunch wheatgrass, which is a native prairie plant species. So this cultivar, Secar, was introduced as a pasture grass, and it's extremely drought tolerant and does really well in areas like Columbia Hills State Park. And it's been estimated that at the time of starting the project that I'm going to tell you about in 2008, the Secar cultivar covered over 80% of the project area, and it was outcompeting the native plant species. So in 2008, Washington State University initiated a study in collaboration with Washington State Parks to look at the use of grazing for restoration and management of 174 acres of the Dalles Mountain Ranch. And you can see here in this photo, the center section is an area that had not been grazed, while the two areas to the sides are areas that had been grazed by cattle. Now, this is a very targeted grazing where it's being done in after the native species have senesced. And so the cattle are really targeting the Secar and getting rid of the above ground biomass of that Secar grass cultivar and eating down some of the thatch. And what we have seen over time has been a great, in the areas that have been grazed, a great reduction in the abundance of that Secar cultivar and an increase in the abundance of our perennial forb species. But what I want to call out is that, you know, really this effort, this wasn't just state parks and this wasn't just Washington State University. The success of this is really due to some really dedicated members of the Native Plant Society who were engaged in supporting the research effort, who've been engaged in monitoring this area when we haven't been able to get down there, who've been really the best cheerleaders for the work in restoring this area, as well as doing seeding and doing planting and putting in a lot of time and effort to make this project a success. And we're continuing to learn from this effort and use it in adapting our adaptive management plans for Columbia Hills State Park. So leaving Columbia Hills, which should be in full bloom soon and a great place to visit, we'll then head further east over to Steptoe Butte State Park and natural area. So Steptoe Butte, as I mentioned, the butte itself, and you think about the entire area of prairie there, is the largest area of Palouse Prairie that remains in the state of Washington. And for a long time now, a portion of the butte has been part of a state park. But the state park really only included, if you see that the banner, that for sale sign on that photo, it really only included the road that snaked over to the top and kind of a small, relatively small chunk of land near the top of the actual butte itself. While the majority of the prairie, all of that area in blue there, 437 acres, of which was in private ownership. Now, it was thought that the reason why the butte itself hadn't previously been used more for agriculture was because it was relatively steep, fairly rocky, a little bit harder to get equipment on. But there was concern that once this butte went up for sale, potentially someone could buy it, and if not, plow it under, definitely could develop it and turn it into home sites. And really, Steptoe Butte was saved by concerned citizens. Again, another story about the power of people who really care about these places. And a Bellevue couple, along with a couple who are from Eastern Washington, in partnership, they stepped up and they bought Steptoe Butte, and hoping that they could find an agency to take over the ownership of that. But without them, the land would have gone to auction without any of the agencies being able to react as quickly as needed for the preservation. They then did work with the Department of Natural Resources and State Parks as a supportive partner to then move that prairie over into public ownership, and is now part of a natural area. So it's still the butte. It's the larger butte itself is owned partially by state parks, owned partially by the Department of Natural Resources, and we work on collaborative management of this to maintain the butte as a natural prairie. Steptoe Butte, in addition to supporting, just overall this largest chunk of Palouse Prairie that remains in the state, it also supports a couple of different rare grassland prairie plant communities, and is host to 2 endemic plant species, as well as species that are state listed as threatened or endangered. And I definitely encourage you to attend Dr. Rebecca Brown's talk on April 24th, where she'll be talking much more about restoration of the Palouse Prairies. I'm sure she's going to have a lot more beautiful photos of the Palouse Prairie grasslands, and be a lot to learn about the work that she's been doing. So hopefully I've left you with a sense that although there are challenges that our prairies are facing because of the lack of disturbance, the development that has just caused us to lose some, the pressures from invasive species and climate change, which is really changing the fundamental landscape that all of our different native ecosystems are playing in, that there really is some hope for our prairies within our state. First off, just by the conservation, by efforts from public citizens, even in making sure that these systems aren't lost through greater development. And then through partnerships and the considered use of a bunch of different management tools, we have learned and are continuing to learn how it is that we can move these systems from these degraded states into a much more natural state that provide much better functions, both for the animals and plant species that rely on them, but also for human use and enjoyment. And so I wanted to end this talk with just one of my favorite quotes about prairie ecosystems that was stated by James Clyman, a frontiersman, back in 1845, which I really think gives you a sense of what this area used to look like. Very different from what we see today, but really was a prairie all luxuriantly clothed in a rich and heavy coat of vegetation, the upland in yellow and the valleys in purples. The quantity of small flowering vegetals is very remarkable and beyond conception. And I look forward to getting into some more of these areas of small flowering vegetals more in the near future, and hopefully you'll be able to as well. So thank you again for attending tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come in.
Thank you, Andrea. As I try to get my face back up here. This should be challenging. Anyhow, well, there I am. So I'm going to go and look and see what kind of questions we have. And folks, you can continue adding questions. Kate, let me see, Alejandro said, how long does it take, or asks, how long does it take to see restoration practices are taking effect?
That is a great question. You know, on a small scale, depending on I hate these kinds of answers. It depends. You know, on a small scale, in some areas, you can start to see, depending on how degraded it was, you can start to see impacts within a few years. In many cases, it takes 3, 4, 5 years to really start to see that impact. But it kind of does depend on how degraded an area was. But even the first year after a fire, you'll see, you know, within a, if you burn in the fall and then see what comes up in that next spring, you will see usually a greater abundance of native prairie species. It's just that it can't end there. And I think that's why I'm hedging my answer a little bit. Sorry, I'm going on, but the problem with restoring these prairie ecosystems is that the same disturbance that helps bring back our native prairie species are the same disturbances that invasive species often like. And so you can't just disturb the prairie and then expect it to come back. It's going to take a lot of follow-up actions in order to keep the prairie going in the right trajectory, the direction that we want it to go in.
All right. Elena, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure. There are a lot of questions popping up in here, so I'm going to start at the top. Okay, so Janine asks, it seems like prairies are, for lack of a better word, sort of lacking in resiliency if they need such management to exist. They seem to need fires, are susceptible to invasive species, etc. And so her question is, how do we put that in context as to what would be an ideal amount of prairie if they need intense management? It's kind of a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a good question. So I think it's going back to that question of what do we think, how do we define ideal? And in a lot of ways, that's a value judgment. So before settlement, prairies were the prairies that are maintained by disturbance. So if you take out the bald communities, which don't require as much disturbance, they probably were burned and had some fire, but they don't need as much fire to maintain them. But the kinds of prairies that I focus on tonight, they did require this regular disturbance, but that was part of the broader ecosystem when you consider that people were also part of the ecosystem then, and they managed them through that regular burning. And so once we remove that disturbance, then yes, and then add in invasive species, it does require a lot more intensive management. the answer as far as how much is the right amount of prairie, that is a value judgment that we have to decide. We have decided as a broader community that is important to keep enough prairie that is preserving the rare plants and animals that rely on them, that we value these ecosystems in and of themselves, that we want to have them around, as well as the fact that these prairies are still really important areas for many different Native peoples within our region. And while they're not able to practice as much of their traditional harvesting as they used to historically, they do still use these areas. And that is an important thing for us to consider in maintaining these prairies as native ecosystems. In addition, some of these places are important for other cultural reasons. And so these are all values that we've decided are important and are reasons for us to maintain these prairie ecosystems.
Thank you. Charlotte asks, can you talk a bit more about the lack of seed and seed banks?
Yeah, and so that's really just a factor of, in a lot of these areas, because the native plant communities had declined to such small, there's so few of them, and that the seeds don't typically last a really long time in the soil, that once we restored them, there wasn't enough seed left in the soil, that it's not like we could just burn them and then hope that the native seeds would come up from the soil enough to repopulate the community enough. And so we just have to seed, add seed back into the system in order to get the prairie back, get an abundance of native plant species. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Susan, and she asks, in what areas and why can you not burn with prescribed fires to conserve prairies in the South Sound prairies?
We are lucky in the South Sound area that we and actually state parks, the closest that state parks manages in the South Sound is down at Lewis and Clark. But DNR and DFW and Joint Bases McCord have been able to use a lot of prescribed fire in their management. And so I think that area is actually pretty lucky in its ability to use prescribed fire. The biggest constraints being that there's a very small window of opportunity where you're able to use prescribed fire in any 1 year in order to both have the ecological benefit that you want to have, as well as not have any risk of the fire getting out of control and the availability of staff. So it's not easy to burn as much as you want to, but we are lucky in that we have that as a tool that we can use here.
Megan asks, can you tell us a bit more about the native plant communities supported of Steptoe Butte?
That is a great question, Megan. And I see Renee, you also have a similar question about the plant communities in the South Sound Prairies. And I did not write the names of those plant communities down, but I can maybe ask Gail or Lena to keep track of the questions that I don't have answers to, and I can find a way to get some answers out following this talk.
Okay, Elena, I'm going to pass that opportunity on to you.
Perfect. Okay.
And we're up to Sally. Sally, South Heel is a native. Is the European variety invasive?
The one that I was thinking of is invasive. This could be another issue of common name issues, or my memory could be serving me wrong, but I was thinking of an invasive, yes.
Thank you.
All right. Next question is from Jamie. Is there a field guide or handbook of prairie species?
I'm trying to think. There are a couple of great guides to restoration of the prairies. The Cascade Prairie and Oak Partnership has a lot of great resources on prairies on their webpage, and I would definitely recommend checking that out. I can't remember if there's a handbook specifically of prairie species, but if there is one, it would probably be listed on there.
Okay, this is a comment from Kate, not really a question, but I'll share that for the larger audience. In Wisco, our prairies will grade into savannah, and you'll get more nitrogen fixing forbs as you get closer to the trees, oaks. So that was interesting. And Russell asked, how do you control burns that bring back the prairie versus large fires that seem to consume everything?
This would probably be a great question for Dave Wilderman's talk, because I'm sure he'll be talking about the prescribed fire. That said, I can say that they, manage the fires to burn off thatch and when done in the right time, they don't get so, they are managing them at a time of the year and with the right kind of humidity conditions, so that they are getting the right conditions within that burn as far as heat and how much gets consumed, so they're not, cooking down through the organics within the soil. So it's something that they know how to manage those conditions in order to achieve the results that they want.
Okay, we have a question from Zachary, and he asks, are there any negatives to prairies? Seems like a lot of space that goes unused, at least from a human's perspective.
Yeah, I think people, given different perspectives, some people would say that about trees that aren't intended to be harvested as well. And that's really again, it's a value judgment. Do you value native ecosystems and species and habitats? But I think, beyond habitat, prairies do provide a lot of carbon sequestration. They have a ton of biomass that they're storing below ground. They provide other ecosystem services like flood prevention in some areas. So there are many benefits to prairies. And so I think it's a question of whether or not, how much we value that.
Thank you. Mickey Chamness asked, would burned shrub steppe be considered a prairie if it doesn't regain sagebrush, but might have rabbit brush?
No, it's a great question, Mickey. And actually, in a different version of this talk, I have talked about the grasslands that form after fires in the shrub steppe ecosystem, where we do have a dominance of grasses and forbs. I think rabbit bush might be getting a little bit too shrubby, but that's a question for the folks at the Natural Heritage Program and how they define plant communities, and at what percentage does it start to shift into a shrub steppe community versus a grassland community. And that's not something I know off of the top of my head, but that is definitely one of the stages, is after a shrub steppe fire, it does become a grassland community before it then starts to become more of a shrub steppe community again.
Great. Okay, so our next question is from Haley, and they ask, how does someone get more involved in getting rid of invasive species? And I know that there are lots of different ways for people to do that, but maybe from your perspective, Andrea, can you?
Well, I was going to turn that one over to Gail, but I think there are plenty of organizations that are happy to have volunteers. At most of our parks, if you live near a state park, there are often friends groups who help with invasive species efforts. But I am going to turn it right over to Gail, because I know that there are several efforts that the Native Plant Society are involved in.
We have wonderful native plant stewards programs, and it depends where you're located, how soon we're having trainings. We're going to have training out at Spokane next year in the fall. a 30-hour program and a 100-hour program in Federal Way. But there are many other opportunities. There's Friends of the Palouse, if you're out that way, to get involved in there. And they are working, groups are working really hard to do that. If you're on the western side of the state, depending where you live, we have wonderful native plant steward programs up and down the west part of the state. And in my background, you'll see a park that I'm the native steward for, and that's China Lake, and that used to be all blackberry. So now it is fireweed and wonderful, wonderful, wonderful plants growing everywhere. We're putting them in. So you can reach me at WNPSpresident@WNPS.org, and I'll give me your name and location, and I'll see if I can connect you to a local group in your area. So thank you for that. And Jacqueline asks, beyond disturbance regimes, are there prairies in Washington also tied to specific substrates? Seems like there's variation, rocky outwash, plains to rich soils and the Palouse.
Yes, so they are tied to specific soil types, and there is variation, and that's really getting to the fact that the Palouse prairies are very different than are pretty different to the prairies that we have in, say, the South Sound. So you can tie the grassland prairie communities in our bioregion ecoregion over here in Western Washington. There are specific soil types that are associated with prairie communities. Similarly, there are specific soil types that are associated with the Palouse prairie communities. So there are different types, and that leads to them being, and then related to that, they are classified as different prairie grassland communities, and related to that, some of the species are are different between those two different plant communities. But the Washington Natural Heritage Program actually has a great paper on the soil communities that are tied to prairie communities in the South Sound region. And often that's coming from that glacial outwash history.
Thank you.
Okay, there are a few questions in here about prescribed grazing. And so I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit, Andrea, and talk about that process. And then a specific question about that is, how do you determine the right timing to favor native plants when it comes to prescribed grazing?
Yeah, so the use of grazing is dependent on site and what your goals are for a site. At Columbia Hills, the idea was that we didn't want to have any impacts to the native plant species. So we didn't want to have animals grazing when the native plants were actively growing. So after we wanted to target, and really this is the professor who was leading the research at the time, targeting grazing after the natives had senesced. And the intention was to reduce down the biomass of that CCAR cultivar. And so the grazing is done in late fall, early winter, when there just, really isn't much out there other than the CCAR. And when the ground is also not going to be, super wet and susceptible to damage by hooves, although, some little impacts can actually increase some diversity within the system. It's a very short duration of grazing. So looking, targeting a specific amount of biomass that's removed. And so not just leaving the cows out there for a long period of time. So it's really thinking about what specific effects that they want with the grazing and targeting those effects. And in this several years that we've been using grazing at Columbia Hills, there have been years when we haven't had cows out there because we felt like there just wasn't enough of the CCAR to support the grazing by the cows without then having a negative impact on the native species that were in the system. I've been involved in some other work where we looked at the use of sheep grazing at different times of year. Sheep, graze in a very different way than cows do, but the idea was that they could help. It was in an area that, because of how close it was to an urban area, it wasn't possible for them to do a prescribed burn. And so it was a way for them to use sheep to reduce down the biomass of grasses that maybe were crowding out other species. In addition, it had been an area that had previously been used for agriculture, so it was relatively flat, and it was kind of a wet prairie ecosystem. So the thought was that the action of the sheep moving around could help to create some more of that micro topographic variation that you get when you know, if you ever walk across a wet prairie and you're like kind of twisting your ankles as you're walking across, that the sheep can help to create some of those differences as well that create microsites for different species. So again, it's thinking about what specific impacts you want and then having a really targeted program to meet those targets.
There was an answer to a question about a book, and I'm going to skim down to it. Chris Newmiller suggests Thurston County Plant Prairie Manual is a great resource for prairie plants. And there's also a book on the vascular plants of the prairies, and Evergreen College publishes that one. And I can't think of the professor's name. She's but I know South Sound helped fund that project.
Okay.
So the next question is from Richard. Are there any efforts to buy agricultural land near some of these state parks to increase the area available for restoration?
We do look to see when different opportunities come up for land purchases, and you know, try to do that when they make sense. It's a challenge because often we have no lack of areas that need to be restored and managed. Yeah, adding land is not always the best answer for us, unfortunately, in the issue of conservation and restoration. But that is something that state parks at least actively looks for.
All right. Our next question, I think, is a pretty broad one. And I think you covered some of this in your talk, but maybe you can expand on it a little bit. How do we ensure diverse prairies in the face of climate change?
I think so. The challenge with climate change is that we know things are going to shift over time, and the best thing that we can do for, you know, making this prairies most resilient in the face of climate change is helping to make sure that they have enough diversity and capacity to adapt with the changes in climate, because we don't necessarily know how all the individual components are going to change. So the closer we can get the systems to being native functioning systems with the fewest amount of human inputs, the best ability those systems are going to have to adapt to climate change. So it's really using all the other tools in our toolbox to try to bring them back to this native place with as few invasive species as possible.
And Janine asks, I'm wondering why it is that the rare plants which grow on prairies don't grow in non-prairie areas, like say our native gardens and yards or in the other fields. Can we not grow camas and paintbrush in non-prairie areas?
I see Gail smiling. I'm guessing your thought, Gail, is that you identify this question as well, and I know I do. Some we can. And when I was living in Oregon, I converted my front yard to native prairie, and I know of some folks in our area that have beautiful little native prairies in their yards here in the Olympia, Tumwater, Lacey area. So you definitely can. Some of them are cranky though, and they like some of the paintbrushes require specific, they're hemiparasites, meaning that they require another species that they can parasitize in order to live. And so you have to make sure that they have the right partner. in order to grow well. And some other native prairie species are just that there's a secret sauce to being in a native prairie, and whether it be soil types, different fungal communities, that they need to grow well. But you certainly can grow a lot of them. And I certainly encourage more people to think about bringing native prairie plants into their yards.
Okay, our next question is about cattle. So earlier, wheat fields were mentioned as a threat to prairies. Is the cattle industry a threat as well?
Yeah, I think just because of the productivity of the area, thinking about Eastern Washington, the productivity and the value of the crops of wheat and lentils and the other agricultural crops in the Palouse, it's more valuable than cattle and has already resulted in much of the conversion. There's certainly other grassland areas that have been grazed heavily and at times overgrazed. But there's other areas where cattle have been used really for restoration purposes. I saw Sarah Hammond was on the talk earlier. I don't know if she's still with us, but Sarah is with the Eco Studies Institute, and they've been working with private dairy farmers and others who have cattle within the South Sound region, and using again the cattle grazing as a way to help restore the native prairies, and have found that they can be very compatible if done in the right way and at the right time. So can be a threat, but can also be a good thing.
And Chris asks, is the map of the historic and current extent of the South Sound prairies available on the web?
Yes, if Elena will keep track of that as another thing for me to provide, I will track that down and include that.
Thank you, Alana.
Okay. What are the large herbivores and predators that traditionally populated prairie areas?
So in our region, we had a lot of deer and elk, and predators, cougars, coyotes, a lot of the same species that were here traditionally. It's thought that our prairies were not probably maintained by grazing. If you look at some of the maps, it shows that bison may have gone into like a small corner of the Palouse, but it's not believed that they were really playing much of a part in our prairie ecosystems.
Are there in US, perhaps in the Midwest, where acreage of prairies is much more than in the Washington?
Yeah, Susan, you nailed it with the Midwest. There's, historically there were, much greater areas of prairies in the Midwest, and I think probably acre for acre, they probably still have more prairie remaining.
All right. Over time, would species that are uncommon or have limited ability to be purchased for seed find their way back into the mix into prairies naturally, or would they have to be seeded by humans, e.g. orchids, Spalding's catchfly? Is the original level of biodiversity ever achieved?
Oh, that is another great question. I think unfortunately for some of the species, we know that even the sites that we have restored, kind of our best restoration sites, that even what we know of what the prairies historically used to look like, we know that there are species that we're missing, that we're not getting back. And so it's a challenge, and especially for some of the ones that are more rare, either it's harder to get them back because they're harder to grow out, or they need something special in order to make them grow that we just don't know about. And so it's a challenge and something that we haven't quite perfected.
So Richard asks, do the federal or Washington state government have seed programs focused on prairies?
DNR and DFW collaborate with some private nonprofits in rural, and but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has really been a big supporter of native seed grow up programs, and have actually just started a new initiative to really increase the availability of native seed. And they have been big supporters of some native seed programs throughout the ecoregion and statewide.
Okay, here's an easy question for you, Andrea. I recognize the chocolate lily in camas and the photo on the final slide. What's the yellow flower?
Well, unfortunately, it's not so, I would normally say it's not so easy anymore because I spend way too much time in front of the computer and not nearly enough time out botanically as I like to, but I can say it's biscuit root. So it's a species of Lomatium is the genus. So that one I know. Thank you, Renee.
Is the broad swath of prairie communities that you showed from BC through Oregon largely due to the historic management of those areas by Native people who were burning them regularly?
Yep. Yeah, that's our understanding, Mary.
Yeah.
Are there any good resources covering supporting prairie development and recovery on steep slopes?
Oh, steep slopes specifically. I would, again, my go-to are the resources on the Prairie, Cascade Prairie Oak Partnership website. And we can get the link and the resources that I'm promising to provide. I can drop some links in there.
I am also wondering about whether the Washington conservation districts do a good job of representing prairie habitats and trying to steer farmers towards practices which would help prairie habitat.
Yeah, I can't say for conservation districts all over the state, but I do know of several conservation districts who have been actively participating in looking towards how they can help farmers use practices that are consistent with prairie restoration management, including, as I mentioned, even managing their cattle in a way that helps to promote different prairie species. So I do think there's a lot of engagement and interest in that.
Well, Andrea, that was the last question. So you're not, I can't thank you enough for your time and presenting this. And I know Elena will get back to you with the questions you want answers, you wanted to save. And, there's one, let's see, there's something in the chat. Let's see what that is. Oh, that's Elena saying the recording will be available within 48 hours. And she's giving the link, www.NPS.org/WNPS-events/virtual-events. So it will be available there. And two more questions real quick. How much is a natural resources conservation services get involved in this area? Oh, one question.
I know they have been involved, and in fact, they one of their programs helped fund some oak restoration in our wet prairie, the drier parts of the wet prairie at Lewis and Clark State Park several years ago. But since I work for a state agency, I'm not as familiar with how much they're involved. They might be. I'm just not as familiar with their efforts in this area.
And there are many thank yous coming in for a wonderful talk. So I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did, because it was wonderful. And thank you all for joining us this evening for the kickoff for WNPS. And thank you for supporting WNPS and Native Plant Appreciation Month. You can join WNPS or renew at any time at WNPS.org/renew. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a pleasant evening. Good night.
Bye.